Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to answer the fabulous musical question, why are the Bach people so nasty? My goodness. There's sort of a competition. Since I started doing this channel, it has given me an unprecedented opportunity to be in direct touch with the universe of classical music listeners. When you have a magazine or you're running a magazine, you're not dealing with people in real time the way I am with these videos. It's been very educational. And part of my purpose in doing this channel and in creating this channel is to create a forum for discussion about great music and great composers, and bring more people into the mix and see where we wind up. And I know that the Crazies are out there, and I know that the Crazies have nothing better to do but sit around on the internet and comment on things. And so, yes, they lurk. And so there seems to be a contest in the composer cult department for nastiest between the Wagner people and the Bach people. And the Wagner people, I expected. I have to say, of course, we all expect that because we know Wagner people are nuts. We know that. Wagner also was someone who deliberately intended to invent a cult of himself. So that was his purpose in life. And so, yeah, it kind of worked. And he was a nasty bastard. And so the people who tend to follow him, have a certain, take a certain pleasure in being, nasty bastards too sometimes. And of course, all the anti-Semites congregate there. Still, you would think, 150 years after he bit the big one, he went to meet his maker, or at least in the other direction, that business would have been resolved. But no, he's still, you still find them hanging out in the Wagnerian arena. At least I have, given the comments about, if I talk about Wagner. So yes, the Wagnerites are out there. But I have to say, in spite of all of that, yeah, they tend to be, not too terrible. But the Bach people, Bach, good old Bach. What could you possibly get upset about talking about Bach? Well, it seems there are quite a few things. Bach never established himself as a cult of personality type person. He just wrote music. He wrote amazing music, some of which I like and some of which I don't like. And it seems to me that if I had to choose the most important video that I have made thus far, it would be the video called My Bach Problem, in which I put a link to it down here so you can go see it if you haven't yet. But I thought it was a pretty harmless video. I really did. It just talks about how I like some Bach and don't like some other Bach, like most of us normal humans, right? There's some things we like and some things we don't like. I didn't say there's anything wrong with the music. It's me. It was my problem. That was the point. But that's not good enough for some people, evidently. For some people, and look, let me just say right away, 99.9% of the people who love Bach are marvelous. I am not talking about normal folks. I am not talking about, that there's this large pack of ravening lunatics. Well, it's not small, actually, but there is a pack of ravening lunatics who are Bach people, and the things that they say because they're Bach people. Most recently, I got a comment saying, "How dare you be a music critic and opine about music if you do not?" Well, the bottom line was witlessly admire everything that Bach wrote. It's so bizarre. And it was so nasty. You're a disgusting, awful pile of crap. They curse, they carry on. But the idea that you can't be a music critic if you criticize, that was really special. That was really interesting. And then there are the people who take the, Bach is the voice of God. He had a direct line of communication, Nobody would claim that Wagner did. But, that except maybe in Parsifal. Nah, not even there. But, that Bach had a direct line to the divine, and therefore to criticize Bach is something is blasphemy. It's a form of horrible, awful, terrible blasphemy for which the only penalty is death. There's that thing. And, that is so ridiculous. It's ridiculous. The very idea is ridiculous. But that happens to be a concept which is promulgated by the Bach military-industrial complex. You have John Eliot Gardner writing a book on music from the castle of heaven, or whatever it's called. This idea, which is absolutely ridiculous. There's no question that Bach was a religious guy. There's no question he wrote lots of religious music. The purpose of that religious music, for the most part, 99.9% of it, was entertainment. That was the problem he had, of course. The reason that the authorities in those days permitted music in the churches is because people went to hear the music. It wasn't because they were particularly interested in going to church. There was this idea that everybody was devout. Well, no, people were not devout. People were forced to be devout by the authorities, by the state religion, by the monarch's religion, or whoever's it was. Whoever it was, you had to go. It was imposed uniformity and conformity when it came to belief, and if you didn't do it, you got in trouble. So people went, and they figured, well, if they're going to go, they're going to hear a concert. It's going to be lovely. You listen to the music, and you go home. Whether they paid any attention to what the religion was saying, well, we know the history of the period in question. We know that wasn't happening all that often, was it? People were paying lip service to what the religion said. And whether Bach felt that he was, celebrating the glory of God with everything that he wrote, or whether he was simply doing his job, well, that's up in the air, isn't it? It's an open question. Probably it was a combination of both. There were things that he cared about enormously and things that he cared about less. And there's no way that as a composer, none of that has anything to do with music. None of it. None of it is a musical consideration. It's very interesting when we consider, the contemporary attitude toward things that have to do with religion. In a way, it's kookier than it ever was back in the day, because back in the day, it was like the air you breathed. Everybody had to believe something, or most people believed something, and some people didn't, but they generally had a very difficult and unpleasant life. And if you, and in a community like Leipzig, where Bach was, you were a member of that church, and you went to that church, and you had to believe that religion, and so you just did. It was part of your life. If you gave it a second thought, maybe there were those who did. Certainly there were those who did, of course, but it's like everything else. There were people who were more religious than other people. We don't know what Bach's actual position was on any of these things. We know he did his job, and that's about all that we know. And he did it so well that people believe, well, it must have been, only true faith that could have produced these masterpieces. Well, that's just garbage. It was musical talent that produced those masterpieces. And that was that. It has nothing to do with what Bach may or may not have believed. The bottom line is, let me tell you a story. I like telling stories. It's a very interesting story. I was once flying home from Stanford, and I was teaching a course that semester in modern philosophy. I was TAing for under one of the professors there. And we read all kinds of interesting books, Herbert Marcuse, Eros and Civilization. And one of the texts was Nietzsche's The Antichrist. Well, that's a somewhat controversial thing, and it's really, great fun because it horrifies people even today. It's a wonderful subject for conversation at the university level. Whether that'll still be permitted to be taught is an open question. Anyway, so I'm on the plane, and I'm sitting next to a girl, a woman about my age, looked like about early 20s. We got to chatting, and I said to her, where do you live? What are you doing? Just normal things. And she said, well, she was from Connecticut, and I was from Connecticut, and I was going home to see my parents, and she was going home to see her parents, and it was all very nice. And so I said to her, well, what do you do? And she said, well, I used to sell insurance. I said, okay, that's fine. What do you do now? She said, well, now that I found Jesus, I went, oh no, here we go. Now that I found Jesus, I am going to Africa to, preach to the heathen and what's not and all that stuff. And she looks at me and she says, of course, well, have you found Jesus? And I said, oh, I didn't know he was lost. And she said, well, what are you looking at? What are you reading? Well, I was reading Nietzsche's The Antichrist. And I said, no, that's nothing, nothing you'd be interested in. She said, no, really, what is it? So I tossed it over there and she looked at it and she said, what is this? And I said, well, it's by Friedrich Nietzsche. And she said, who's that? And I said, well, one of the great philosophers of Western civilization. And she said, no, he wasn't. I said, why wasn't he? She said, because he would never have written something like that if he was serious. I said, oh, well, all right. She said, when did he write it? He said, I said around 1888, something like that. She said, no, he didn't. I said, well, why didn't he? And she said, because everybody believed in God back then. And I said, well, some people did, and evidently some people didn't, at least not as much. I said, but, you don't have to read it. She said, no, I certainly will not. She hands it back to me, and she was getting very huffy, and I could see that, she was sitting there, and she's starting to vibrate and jump around in her seat. And finally, she pushes the call button for the stewardess. And the stewardess comes up to her and says, may I help you? And she stands up and points at me like this and screams at the top of her lungs to everybody on the plane, I will not be seated next to this emissary of Satan. And the stewardess was absolutely fabulous. And everybody turns around and looks at me, and I'm like, hi, Turns around and she says, she was great. She says, well, if we'd known Satan was on the plane, we certainly wouldn't have seated him next to you. Would you like to change your seat? And she says, I certainly will. I will not sit next to Satan. So she stormed off to the back of the plane somewhere. And we resumed, and I looked up at the stewardess. I said, boy, you handled that well. And she looked at me and she said, we get him all the time. It was quite marvelous. But the point is that people have this notion that because a composer like Bach was totally consumed with writing liturgical music, that he must have therefore been some sort of avatar sent from above to commune with the beyond. And that's all just our strange modern attitude that comes from ignorance of the past, number one, and a refusal to allow the possibility that people had their own individual views of these things, even back in Bach's day, and that actually a lot of those views may have been even more casual than they are today, because here, where we live in an era where there is a certain separation between church and state, and where people's religion is a personal thing, there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of competition to make yours the one, and to make an issue of the fact that you belong to a certain religion. But if you go to a Catholic country, or you go to one of these countries in Europe, it's not so much a big deal. It really isn't. My nephew, grew up in Italy, in Milan, and there, there is a state religion, and they teach Catholicism in school. And he's Jewish, and he got exempted, and he was quite admired because he didn't have to go to religion class, which of course everybody hates. And in every classroom there is this enormous crucifix, at the front of the classroom. And my sister, is concerned that he might feel somewhat, intimidated by this fact. And she said to him, do you have any issue with, the fact that there's a huge crucifix over, in every classroom? And he looked at her and he said, where? What do you mean? I mean, that's the kind of thing we get, but we look at it so differently these days, because what do we have? Well, this is the remnant of what we have, Bach's work as a composer of sacred music, for the most part. But, the fact that he had no compunction about taking, choruses from secular cantatas and stuffing them into his sacred cantatas, and vice versa, gives us some idea of how he really felt about it. musically. Anyway, that was a whole digression, but it's interesting. It's very interesting because the nature of the screaming hatred aimed at me by these people who are offended is the hatred of one who has blasphemed against the deity. That's where they're coming from. And that is so freaking sick. I mean, it's really nuts and horrible. Really fascinating. That, and of course, the, oh, you poor dear, the one who thinks that you must be somehow mentally challenged because you don't feel the way they do. And you haven't recognized the cosmic, amazingness of it all and whatnot. But it's been astonishing because in the past, I don't know, 6 months or so, it seems that in the crazy competition, and I'm going to keep talking about the crazy competition here, the Bach people have certainly overtaken the Wagner people. And I never would have expected that. Never in a million years. It just shocks me. It really does. Because, if anything, you would think that Bach's music is, if it's all about theoretically higher moral values from a higher power, that people would comport themselves accordingly. But as we all know from history, that ain't what happens, especially when it comes to people who believe they have the absolute truth. And the reason I think then that the Bach problem video is my most important video actually is because, first of all, one of the jobs of a critic is to engender some controversy. Legitimate controversy, I feel, not just to, for the sake of it, but to ask reasonable questions that people can reasonably debate. And second of all, to tell all of you out there, you don't have to like anything. There's no obligation to like anything. You can't dismiss it. I mean, I'm more than happy to say that the things I don't like about Bach are my problem. That's why I called it my Bach problem. It's not that Bach was a bad composer. A lot of people do that. A lot of people say, well, if I don't like something, it's bad music. That's not true. The other thing I really hope that this channel will do is inculcate in my viewers the idea that there is great music that you recognize as great, that you accept as great, that may be great, and it's just not for you. It's just not for your taste. It's just not. You don't have any obligation to like it. The fact that you don't like it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, and it doesn't mean there's something wrong with the music. It's just not your cup of tea. And we move on with life with things that are our cup of tea. And I think that's really the important lesson that we take from this. And that's why I bring this subject up repeatedly, because I think it's incredibly important if we're going to become confident in our own skins and knowledgeable, and if we're going to really love what we do, what we enjoy, that we deal with our classical music culture, this whole thing out here, with a certain amount of casualness, that it is, as Bach's religion was, just like the air we breathe, part of the environment. And we can take or leave however much suits us individually. And the fact that we like something or don't like something doesn't mean that it's great. You can't let your self-image be tied up in your musical taste, because musical taste is just that. It's just a component. It's like a spice. It's like saying that you're a better person than someone else because you like cinnamon babka as opposed to chocolate babka. No, doesn't work that way. You have to be able to like what you like with confidence and dislike what you dislike with confidence without having to, trash those who disagree with you, unless they're completely, totally insane, like the lunatic fringe of the Bach cult. So I actually hope that they keep migrating here, because this is an ongoing conversation, and I think it's an important one. And I think it's a very important one to have around the figure of J.S. Bach, who is such an iconic figure in Western music. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.